On December 7, 1941, Japan made a decision that completely changed the course of history. They attacked Pearl Harbor. In just a few hours, a large part of America's Pacific Fleet was destroyed, and because of this, the United States was finally drawn into the Second World War. But if you think about it, it doesn't seem reasonable. Why would Japan willingly challenge a country with a bigger population, a stronger industry, more factories, and more natural resources? It's like a small company willingly competing against the biggest business in the world. The leaders of Japan knew they couldn't defeat America in a long war, so the real question isn't why they attacked America. Instead, the real question is why they reached this point, and the answer began in China. But before we start the discussion, I'd like to ask you for a like and please subscribe to our channel. This is a huge help for us content creators, so let's get started. In the late 1930s, Japan was already bogged down in a war they expected to end quickly. In 1937, they launched a large-scale invasion of China. Many military officials believed they could quickly force Chiang Kai-shek's government to surrender, but they were wrong. Instead of a quick victory, it became a long and costly war. As time went on, more and more soldiers were needed. More and more weapons, bullets, food, vehicles, and fuel were also needed. Even though they were able to capture cities, China continued to fight back. It was like an army that kept advancing but never reached the finish line. And because of this, Japan's strength and wealth were gradually being depleted. The situation got even worse because the country's natural resources were limited. Unlike America or the Soviet Union, Japan really had only a small amount of oil, iron, and other important resources. So to maintain their military machine, they needed to get resources from other places. As their needs grew, their problems also increased, and that's when the Western countries started to worry. America gradually saw that Japan's control over Asia was expanding. Because of this, the United States began imposing various economic restrictions on Japan. And because of this, it also became clear to Japan's leaders that their options were becoming fewer. If the war in China does not end, they will continue to need more resources. If they can't get resources, their ability to wage war will collapse. And while they were thinking about this problem, there was another threat in the north, and that was the Soviet Union. In 1939, there was a major clash between the forces of Japan and the Soviet Union on the border of Mongolia. This battle is now known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. For Japan, it was a heavy shock. They thought they could match the Soviets. But in the actual battle, it was clear that the Soviet Union's army under the leadership of Georgy Zhukov prevailed. Many Japanese soldiers died and a lot of equipment was destroyed. More importantly, Japan realized that going to war with the Soviet Union could be a very costly mistake. Because of this, the direction of their military strategy began to change. Instead of looking north, they began to look south. And in the south, some of the most important resources in all of Asia could be found: oil, rubber, minerals, and other materials that Japan desperately needed. But there was a problem. Many of those places were protected or influenced by Western countries like Britain, the Netherlands, and especially the United States. As the 1940s approached, a situation was gradually developing where the war in China. The lack of resources and tensions with Western countries were coming together into a single crisis. This was not yet Pearl Harbor, but it was here that the path began to form, which would eventually lead Japan to one of the most dangerous decisions in its history. A decision that would ignite war across the entire Pacific, and a decision that would change not only the fate of Japan, but the fate of the whole world. Despite this, as Japan's situation worsened, there was one leader who tried to make the war in China a global issue, and that was Chiang Kai-shek. He understood that China would have a hard time defeating Japan if they fought alone. So his goal was not just to fight the Japanese on the battlefield. He also wanted to convince other countries that what was happening in China was not just a simple conflict between two nations. For Chiang, Japan's invasion was a threat to all of Asia. And if it couldn't be stopped, it could affect the whole world. So while his soldiers were fighting, China also started another battle, a battle to gain the support of other countries. Since the war began in 1937, many people in America and Britain sympathized with China. Many journalists, writers, and academics reported about the damage. This was really caused by Japan's invasion. Because of this, support for China gradually grew in some Western countries. But sympathy alone was not enough. What Chiang needed were weapons. He needed cannons. He needed bullets. He needed military vehicles. And most of all, he needed a steady supply of resources to keep the fight going. In the early years of the war, one of China's biggest supporters was the Soviet Union. According to historians, a large number of weapons and military equipment were sent by Moscow to help the forces of Zhang Jieshi. But the situation changed after the agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. The aid from Moscow gradually decreased. Because of this, China was forced to look for other sources of support. That's when the United States, Britain, and France started to become more important. Although Britain and France were focused on the worsening crisis in Europe, they still continued to help by sending supplies into China. The problem was transporting these supplies wasn't that easy. Many of the materials had to travel along long routes through mountains, forests, and rough roads. One of the most important lifelines for China at that time was the Burma Road. This route connected the ports of Southeast Asia to the interior of China. But transportation was slow, the roads were difficult, and delays often happened. So even though aid was coming in, it wasn't enough to quickly change the course of the war. Meanwhile, in America, there were also individuals who wanted to help China. One of them was Claire Lee Shenoy, a retired U.S. military officer. He helped China strengthen their air force. Eventually, a group of American pilots was also formed who voluntarily fought for China. They became better known as the Flying Tigers. Although they became more famous in the following years, the foundation of this group had already begun even before America officially entered the war. While Chiang was trying to gain support from other countries, he also needed to prove that his government was still capable of fighting. This is why China launched various offensives against Japan at the end of 1939. The goal was to show the world that the fight was not over yet, that China was still capable of fighting and was worth helping. Even though these offensives did not bring major victories, they managed to halt some of Japan's advances and showed that China was still not giving up. But while China was busy seeking help, there was another event that made their situation even more difficult. In 1940, France fell into the hands of Germany. Suddenly, the world's attention shifted to Europe. The countries that used to help China now had bigger problems to deal with. For Chiang Kai-shek, the world was now paying less attention to his war. Meanwhile, Japan saw this as an opportunity. Many leaders in Tokyo believed that while Europe was busy with its own crisis, they could increase their control over the routes used to supply China. In the middle of 1940, Fumimaro Konoe became the Prime Minister of Japan. At that time, the country was facing growing economic problems. There was a shortage of some essential supplies. The costs of the war were also continuing to rise. For many Japanese leaders, their thoughts were clear. If they couldn't cut off the aid going into China, the war could continue for many more years. So they began to focus on the routes used to transport weapons and equipment. One of the most important targets was French Indochina, which is now part of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This place was important because some of the supplies going to China passed through here. In September 1940, Japanese forces entered the northern part of French Indochina. From Japan's perspective, this was a way to increase the pressure against China, but they did not fully realize the consequences it would have. Because of that move, the United States began to worry greatly. For Washington, it was not just about China. They could already see the possibility of Japan expanding its influence more widely throughout the Asia-Pacific region. In response, America began to implement economic restrictions against Japan. This included restrictions on some important materials needed by the country's industry and military. At this point, war had not yet broken out between America and Japan, but the direction of events was already clear. While Japan was trying to stop aid from reaching China, it was also bringing itself closer to a direct confrontation with the United States. And as this crisis deepened, another problem was slowly developing within China itself, a tension that would later have a major impact on the country's future. The growing conflict between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists. Nevertheless, as Japan moved closer to war against America, the situation was heating up not only in Tokyo. Inside China itself, another conflict was beginning to flare up. On paper, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists were allies. But in reality, they didn't truly trust each other. Both of them were fighting against Japan. But both of them were also thinking about who would lead China when the war was over. In 1940, the Communist forces launched a major offensive in northern China. This was known as the 100 Regiments Offensive. Their targets were not only Japanese soldiers. They also destroyed railways, bridges, roads, communications, and other infrastructure used by Japan to control the areas they had occupied. This did not liberate the major cities, but it showed that the Communist forces were not weak. And for Chiang Kai-shek, this was a new problem. Because while Mao was fighting Japan, his own army, influence, and reputation among ordinary Chinese were also growing. In other words, there were two wars happening in China. The first war was China against Japan. The second war was the silent struggle between the nationalists and the communists over who would become the real power in China. After the 100 Regiments Offensive, Japan retaliated harshly. According to many historical accounts, the Japanese army intensified their anti-guerrilla campaign in northern China. One of the most well-known names for this is the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. In simple terms, kill, burn, and plunder. The goal of this was to crush areas suspected of helping guerrilla fighters. It wasn't just soldiers who were affected. Many civilians were caught up in it. Many villages were attacked. Many homes were burned, and many ordinary people paid the price for a war they did not choose. As the violence in China worsened, the pressure inside Japan intensified even more. The civilian government in Tokyo did not have full control over its own military. On paper, there was a prime minister and a cabinet. But in practical terms, the army and navy had tremendous influence. There were times when the military itself pushed for policy, and when they disagreed with the plans of the civilian leaders, they could block or even derail the government's course. This is where the military came in. Hideki Tojo played a major role. Tojo was a tough military leader. For him, Japan should not back down in China, because if they backed down, it would seem that the blood, money, and years they spent on the war would have been wasted. This was one of Japan's biggest traps. The longer they kept fighting, the harder it became to admit that their decision was wrong. They were like gamblers who were already losing but refused to stop because they had already lost so much. So instead of backing down, they pushed forward even more. In April 1941, Japan made an agreement with the Soviet Union. This was the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. This meant that the two countries would avoid direct war with each other for the time being. For Japan, this was a big deal, because if they didn't have to worry about the Soviet Union in the north for now, they could focus more on the south. And in the south was the thing they desperately needed: resources, oil, rubber, tin, rice, and other materials needed by the military and the economy. The problem was, many of the places with resources were controlled by Western powers. Malaya was controlled by Britain. The Dutch East Indies were controlled by the Netherlands. The Philippines was controlled by the United States, and Japan saw these places as the key to continuing their empire. In Japan's propaganda, they claimed that they wanted to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. But in reality, they also wanted to control the region's resources. This means they just replaced the old empire with a new one. And as the temptation to conquer Southeast Asia grew stronger, There was one big obstacle: the United States Pacific Fleet. It was in Hawaii. And for the Japanese Navy, as long as the American fleet was there, any major operation in the Pacific was risky. This doesn't mean that all Japanese leaders wanted to go to war with America. Some in the Navy knew just how powerful the industrial strength of the United States was. They knew that if the war dragged on, America could produce more ships, planes, weapons, and ammunition. Japan couldn't match that kind of production. But there were other officials who believed that Japan had a small window of opportunity. If they acted quickly, they might be able to take Southeast Asia, cut off the supply lines, and force America to negotiate. This was the dangerous mindset that gradually became the center of Japan's strategy. They didn't plan to defeat America in a long war. What they wanted was a quick, powerful, and surprising first strike, a strike that would give them time to expand their control in the Pacific. In July 1941, the situation got even worse when Japan occupied southern Indochina. For America, this message was clear. China was no longer Japan's only target. It seemed they were preparing to move south toward areas rich in oil and other resources. This is when the United States retaliated. President Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in America. And because of this, Japan's access to American oil was almost completely cut off. This was a huge blow because a large portion of Japan's oil at that time came from the United States. If they ran out of oil, their ships would stop, their planes would stop, their tanks would stop, and their ability to continue the war would collapse. At this point, Japan faced three options. First, withdraw from China and Indochina to ease the sanctions. Second, negotiate and wait. Third, push south and seize resources by force. The first option was hard for the military leaders to accept because for them, it was a disgrace. The second option was risky because while they waited, their oil was running out. That's why more and more people in Japan were pushing for the third option: war. This wasn't a sudden decision that just came up overnight. It was the result of many years of miscalculation, a never-ending war in China, defeat and fear of the Soviet Union, lack of resources, sanctions, pressure from America, pressure from the military, and the ambition to expand the Japanese empire. In October 1941, Prime Minister Konoe's government fell. He was replaced by Hideki Tojo. And when Tojo became prime minister, the voices of those who believed that military force was necessary grew stronger. Talks between Japan and America were still ongoing, but they were going nowhere. America wanted Japan to withdraw from China and Indochina, but the Japanese military refused to accept this. For them, withdrawing would be like admitting that all their sacrifices in China were meaningless. So while diplomats continued to talk about peace, the military planners were already making plans for war. Behind closed doors, a list of targets was slowly taking shape. Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and islands in the Pacific. But before they could do that, they first had to face the biggest obstacle: the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. This is where the direction of history began to become clear. Japan was no longer just looking for a way to end the war in China. It was now preparing to open a much larger war across the Pacific. And in their minds, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of the problem. It was the violent solution to a problem they themselves had created. In the final months of 1941, there was almost no time left for diplomacy. Japan and the United States were still talking. Diplomats were flying back and forth. Proposals were being sent. Meetings were being held. But while all of that was happening, both sides already knew they were heading toward a major conflict. For America, their position was simple. If Japan wanted normal trade to resume and the economic sanctions to be lifted, it needed to withdraw from China and Indochina. For Washington, that was the only way to reduce tensions in Asia. But for Japan's military leaders, it was almost impossible to accept such a condition. After many years of war, they had already lost so many lives and spent so much money and resources in China. In their view, leaving was not a compromise. It was a defeat, and they did not want to accept that. As the deadlock intensified, the debate within Japan grew even deeper. Even today, historians still discuss what the main reason really was for why Japan chose war. Some say that it was the economic sanctions imposed by America that pushed them to attack. Others, however, believe that the sanctions were not the cause, but merely the result of Japan's earlier expansion in Asia. In other words, the problem did not start with the sanctions. It began with decisions made by Japan many years before Pearl Harbor. Another major debate is about the true purpose of Japan's southern expansion. There are historians who believe that this was part of the dream to build a vast empire in Asia, a region that would be led by Japan and no longer by Western countries. In their propaganda back then, they called it a new order for Asia. But many countries that were occupied by Japan did not see this as liberation. For them, it was just a new form of colonization. There are also other historians who offer a different explanation. According to this perspective, Japan's most important goal was not the establishment of an empire. The most important goal was the continuation of the war in China. As the fighting went on, their need for oil, steel, rubber, food, and other resources grew even greater. Without these, they would have a hard time continuing their military operations. So for some leaders of Japan, conquering areas rich in resources was not a luxury. It was a necessity. But whatever their true motive was, the result was the same. They gradually went down a path that would lead to direct conflict with the United States. While this was happening, there was another big problem within the Japanese leadership. Not everyone shared the same views. Many Navy officials were worried about the possibility of war against America. They had a reason to be concerned. They knew the true strength of the U.S. Navy better. They knew more about the size of America's industry, and they knew better how many ships, planes, and weapons the factories of the United States could produce. According to their analysis, if a total war started, America would have too much of an advantage in a long conflict. But many Army officials had a different perspective. Because they were more focused on China, they didn't really feel the power of America. Some even believed that discipline, determination, and fighting spirit were more important than the number of ships and factories. This was one of the biggest mistakes in their assessment. While the Navy focused on numbers and production, some Army leaders put more faith in morale and courage. They didn't fully realize how much impact America's industrial power would have once the war began. They were also counting on something else. Some officials believed that when Japan entered Southeast Asia, many local people would welcome them as liberators against the European colonial powers. There were places where some groups helped Japan at first, but in many cases that support didn't last long, because when people saw the real situation under Japanese occupation, their perspective quickly changed. Meanwhile, while debates continued in Tokyo, there was already an operation quietly preparing. Negotiations were still ongoing in public. But behind closed doors, ships were already preparing for a mission that would change history. In the early days of December 1941, Japan's main leaders gathered to decide on their final move. Some still hoped for a diplomatic solution. There were still some who wanted to avoid war, but the influence of those who believed there was no turning back had grown stronger. In those meetings, one thing became clear. It was no longer being debated whether there would be a war. The only thing being debated was how it would begin. And while some diplomats continued to hope for a miracle, a large Japanese naval force was already quietly sailing through the cold waters of the North Pacific. They were not heading to China. They were not heading to the Soviet Union. Their destination was Hawaii. And their target was a military base that, in just a few days, would become the center of one of the biggest surprises in the history of war, Pearl Harbor. If we look at everything that happened, we can see that many leaders of Japan believed they could control the course of history. They thought they could choose when the war would start. They thought they could choose where it would spread. And they thought they could end it before their enemies could fully recover. but almost all of their most important calculations were wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not end Japan's war. Instead, it only made the war bigger. The battle that was once mainly centered in China had now become part of a global war from the Pacific Ocean to Europe. From the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Pacific, millions of people would be affected in the coming years. For Japan, the plan was simple. Deliver a quick and heavy blow, immediately seize key areas rich in oil and resources, and force America to negotiate. But that's not what happened. Instead of retreating, the United States expanded their military mobilization even further. American factories began producing ships, airplanes, tanks, and weapons at a level that almost no other country could match at that time. Gradually, the thing that some Japanese Navy officials had feared from the beginning started to emerge, a long war of production and resources. And in this kind of battle, America had a huge advantage. While Japan's situation was getting worse, China continued to fight as well. Instead of collapsing after Pearl Harbor, global support for Japan's enemies grew even stronger. The war they tried to end only dragged on even longer. By 1945, it was clear that Japan could no longer turn the tide of the war. Next came their defeat in the Pacific. They lost important bases. Their ability to send ships and planes was reduced, and little by little their access to the resources that once fueled their expansion to the south was cut off. Then came the two events that completely changed the world. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union also entered the war against Japan after ending the Neutrality Pact between the two countries. After the Neutrality Pact ended, in a short period of time, Tokyo's remaining hope to continue the fight completely collapsed. And in September 1945, Japan officially surrendered. The Second World War in Asia ended, but the problems it left behind did not end. In China, the already fragile alliance between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong broke apart once again. The temporary cooperation against Japan completely collapsed. The Chinese Civil War broke out again, and in the following years, the fate of the entire country would change. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, a new era was beginning. This was no longer a battle between the Axis and the Allies. It was no longer a fight between Germany, Japan, and their enemies. This was the beginning of the Cold War. Two superpowers would gradually face each other, the United States and the Soviet Union. From this point on, the world would enter a new competition. Competition in influence, competition in technology, competition in military power, and eventually competition in nuclear weapons. In fact, after the Soviet leadership saw the effects of the atomic bomb, they accelerated their own nuclear program even more. In the following years, the nuclear arms race would begin, instilling fear throughout the world for many decades. So when we talk about Pearl Harbor, it's not just a story of a surprise attack. It's not just a story of aircraft carriers, ships, and airplanes. This is a story of how a war that started in China gradually expanded until it became part of the largest global conflict in history. It's also a story of how decisions made by some leaders because of ambition, fear, miscalculation, and lack of compromise led to events that affected the whole world for many generations. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this history. Sometimes a country does not fall because it is weak in battle. Sometimes it falls because it repeatedly chooses to continue a problem that should have been resolved long ago. And for Japan, that problem started in China. But the consequence was a war that engulfed the entire world.